The voice cut through the hangar like a blade through silence. "What in the hell is this?" the lieutenant demanded, his words echoing off the metal walls and high ceilings where MH-60 Seahawk helicopters sat in various states of repair. His boots clicked against the concrete as he strode toward the old man, standing near the far wall with a mop and bucket. "Someone want to explain to me why we have a vagrant contaminating my maintenance floor?" Ezekiel Toomey did not flinch. He did not turn. He simply continued wringing out the mop head with hands that had once pulled 11 drowning sailors from black water, hands that now trembled slightly from age and cold nights spent beneath overpasses. The late afternoon sun streaming through the massive hangar doors caught the gray in his close-cropped hair, still regulation length after all these years. Some habits refused to die, no matter how hard a man tried to bury them. Lieutenant Junior Grade Preston Whitmore stopped 6 feet away, close enough for Ezekiel to smell the coffee on his breath and the starch in his uniform. 26 years old, third-generation Navy, and, assigned to a logistics post, he considered beneath his breeding. Every frustration of his stalled career had found a target in this moment. In this stooped figure, wearing a faded olive jacket held together with safety pins and work boots worn so thin the concrete cold seeped through. "I asked you a question," Whitmore said, louder now, playing to the maintenance crews who had stopped their work to watch. The wrench in one young sailor's hand hung frozen in midair. A hydraulic lift hissed and went silent. Even the constant radio chatter seemed to fade as witnesses accumulated. "You deaf or just stupid?" Ezekiel finally turned. His face was weathered leather, lined and cracked by decades of sun and salt and sorrow. But his eyes, those eyes held something the lieutenant was too young and too proud to recognize. They held the calm of a man who had seen far worse than an officer throwing his weight around. "I was told to clean here, sir," Ezekiel said softly. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Contractor sent me over from Building 7. Whitmore's lip curled. He looked the old man up and down, cataloging every stain, every tear, every sign of a life that had gone sideways. The jacket that might once have been military issue, but now looked like something pulled from a donation bin. The rucksack sitting against the wall, packed with the precision of someone who had learned to make everything fit, because everything he owned had to be carried. Contractor, Whitmore repeated, loading the word with contempt. "Let me guess. One of those programs that hires the—" He paused, searching for the most cutting word, unfortunate to make the base feel good about itself. Several of the maintenance crew shifted uncomfortably. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ramona Vance looked up from her clipboard near the office door, something flickering across her face. She had been watching the old man for 3 weeks now, ever since he started appearing on the cleaning rotation. Something about the way he moved, the economy of his gestures, the way he stood when someone addressed him, shoulders back, chin level, like his spine remembered attention even if his circumstances did not. "I work for the day labor contractor, sir," Ezekiel said. "I go where they send me." "Well, they sent you wrong," Whitmore snapped. "This is a secure maintenance area. Helicopters worth more than you will ever see in 100 lifetimes." He stepped closer, invading the space that Ezekiel held with quiet dignity. "I do not want someone like you anywhere near my aircraft." The words hung in the air. "Someone like you." The maintenance crews looked away. One young petty officer, barely 20, stared at his boots. But wherever you're watching this story from, whether from a city that never sleeps or a town so small it does not appear on most maps, take a moment to look around your own community. There are men and women just like Ezekiel in every neighborhood. Quiet figures whose humble appearances hide stories that would leave you speechless. If you have ever passed someone on the street and wondered about the life they lived before the world forgot them, share where you are from in the comments below. And if stories about hidden heroes and second chances speak to something in your soul, consider subscribing to follow along. Because what happened next in that hangar would change everything. Whitmore pointed toward the back of the building, where a heavy door led to the head facilities. "You want to be useful, go clean the toilets. That is more your speed." He smiled, thin and cruel. "And stay out of sight. We have officers coming through later, and I will not have them seeing." He gestured vaguely at Ezekiel's entire existence. This. Yes, sir, Ezekiel said. He gathered his mop and bucket, moving with that strange, deliberate grace that Senior Chief Vance could not stop noticing. When he bent to pick up his rucksack, his sleeve rode up just slightly, revealing the edge of something on his forearm. Dark ink, faded by time. The curve of what might have been an anchor. Vance frowned and made a mental note. Whitmore watched the old man shuffle toward the back, satisfaction spreading across his face like oil on water. He turned to his audience, to the maintenance crews who had witnessed his performance. Let that be a lesson, he announced. Standards matter. Appearances matter. This is the United States Navy, not a homeless shelter. No one responded. The work resumed, tools clanking, radio chatter rising again. Helicopters being readied for missions that would take them over oceans the old man had once swum through with fire on the surface and death in the deep. In exactly 47 minutes, Lieutenant Junior Grade Preston Whitmore III would be standing at rigid attention in that same hangar. His face would be pale, his hands would be shaking, and for the first time in his privileged life, he would be the one unable to speak. But right now, he knew none of that. Right now, he simply adjusted his uniform, checked his reflection in a helicopter's window, and walked back to his office to file a complaint about contractor personnel quality. The old man disappeared through the door to the head, and Senior Chief Vance quietly moved to her computer terminal, pulled up a search window, and began to type. The smell hit him first. Aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid and the particular metallic tang of machinery kept in constant readiness. Ezekiel stood in the narrow corridor leading to the head facilities, mop handle gripped in both hands. And for a moment, he was not there at all. He was 23 years old, standing on the deck of a helicopter as it banked hard over black water. February wind cutting through his wetsuit. The radio crackling with desperate voices. Fire spreading across the surface of the Persian Gulf where the USS Princeton had just struck a mine, and somewhere in that chaos, 11 sailors were dying. "Toomey, you are not cleared for water entry," the pilot had shouted over the roar of the rotors. "Seas are too rough. Fire on the surface. You go in there, you are not coming back." But he had already unclipped his harness, already felt the weight of the rescue gear on his back. Somewhere below, men were screaming. Men who had families. Men who had lives waiting for them on the other side of the world. "With respect, sir," Ezekiel had said, and then he was falling through the darkness toward water that burned. The mop handle creaked in his grip. He blinked, and the memory receded like a tide that never fully withdrew. 33 years since that night. 33 years since he had swum through fire and hypothermia and the desperate clutching hands of drowning men. 6 hours in water, so cold his body had stopped shivering, which meant his core temperature had dropped past the point of no return, which meant he should have died out there with the rest of them. But he had not died. He had brought them home, all 11 of them, one by one, swimming back to the helicopter's rescue basket again and again until his arms stopped working and they had to haul him up like cargo. Ezekiel pushed through the door to the head and set his bucket on the tile floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly pale glow that made every military bathroom look the same. He caught his reflection in the mirror above the sinks and did not recognize the man staring back. Gray where there had been black. Lines where there had been smooth skin pulled tight over muscle. Eyes that had seen too much and could no longer close without seeing it again. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the chain he never removed. 11 dog tags clicked together, metal worn smooth by years against his chest. He did not need to read the names. He knew them by heart. Reyes, Kowalczyk, Fontaine, Washington, Marchetti, Park, Oduya, Sullivan, Brennan, Little Crow, Delacroix. 11 men who had lived because he refused to stop swimming. One man who had died because he eventually did. Terrence Little Crow had not been on the Princeton. He had been Ezekiel's partner, his brother in everything but blood, a rescue swimmer so gifted that instructors still used his techniques at the training school in Pensacola. They had served together for 7 years. Pulled bodies living and dead from waters all over the world. Terrence had been the one who found Ezekiel after the Princeton rescue, still hypothermic in the medical bay, and had sat with him through the night telling terrible jokes until the shivering finally stopped. Terrence had died in 1998. Training accident. The kind of thing that was not supposed to happen to men who had survived real combat. Equipment malfunctioned during a routine exercise, and suddenly the best swimmer Ezekiel had ever known was gone. That was when the crack started. Hairline fractures in the foundation of who Ezekiel Toomey was supposed to be. And then Elena. He lowered the dog tags back beneath his shirt and picked up a scrub brush. The toilets were not particularly dirty, but he cleaned them anyway because he had been told to clean them and because the work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the dark. Elena had been his anchor. Not the tattoo on his arm, faded now to blue-ray shadows, but the real thing. The woman who had waded through deployments and midnight phone calls and the particular silence of a man who had seen too much death to talk about living. She had held them together when Terrence died, had sat with him through the nightmares, had been there every single time he came home, until the one time she was not. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed while he was on deployment in the Gulf. Again, always the Gulf, always the water that had made him and was slowly unmaking him. They had given her 6 months. She had lasted 4. He had requested emergency leave the moment he found out, but the paperwork had taken too long and the distance had been too far, and by the time he walked through the front door of their home in Virginia Beach, Elena had been in the ground for 2 days. His daughter Marisol had been waiting for him in the living room, 24 years old and wearing black and looking at him with eyes that held grief and something else. Something that might have been blame, or might have been understanding, or might have been both. "She left you a letter," Marisol had said. "She made me promise not to open it." Ezekiel had taken the envelope, cream-colored, his name written in Elena's careful handwriting, and he had put it in his pocket without opening it and had never opened it since. Some words were too heavy to read. Some goodbyes were too final to hear. He had stayed for 1 week. Watched Marisol try to feed him. Listened to her talk about the funeral he had missed. Sat in the bedroom he had shared with Elena for 26 years and felt the walls closing in like the hull of a sinking ship. On the 7th night, he had left a note on the kitchen table. 4 sentences. "I love you. I am sorry. Live your life. Do not look for me." And then he had walked out the front door with nothing but his rucksack and the 11 dog tags and the letter he could not bring himself to open, and he had not stopped walking for 5 years. The scrub brush paused against the porcelain. Ezekiel's hand was shaking, not from cold this time, but from the weight of memory that never got lighter no matter how many miles he put between himself and the life he had abandoned. Through the wall, he could hear the muffled sounds of the hangar. Helicopters being serviced. Young sailors doing the work he had once done. A world that had moved on without him, as worlds always do. He thought about Marisol, wondered if she had kept her promise not to look for him. Hoped she had built something beautiful from the wreckage he had left behind. Still swimming. "Terry," he whispered to the empty bathroom. Still trying. He went back to scrubbing. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, a helicopter was beginning its approach to the base. And the pilot at the controls had no idea that the man he had been searching for his entire career was less than 200 yards away, cleaning toilets on the orders of a lieutenant who had never sacrificed anything. The door to the head banged open with enough force to rattle the paper towel dispenser on the wall. Ezekiel did not startle. Men who had spent years waiting for enemy fire learned to keep their reactions internal, to process threat assessment before their bodies gave anything away. He simply straightened from where he had been scrubbing the base of a toilet and turned to face Lieutenant Whitmore, who stood in the doorway with a look of theatrical disgust. "It smells like a sewer in here," Whitmore announced, though the bathroom smelled of nothing but industrial cleaner and the faint ghost of the bleach Ezekiel had been using. The lieutenant wrinkled his nose and stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. 2 young sailors appeared in the small window, watching. Witnesses again. Always witnesses with men like this. "I'm almost finished, sir," Ezekiel said. He kept his voice level, respectful, the way he had been trained to address officers 40 years ago at boot camp in Great Lakes. Whitmore walked a slow circle around the small bathroom, running his finger along the edge of a sink, checking the mirror for streaks, looking for something to criticize. His reflection showed a man who needed to find fault in others to feel substantial in himself. "You know what I think?" the lieutenant said, stopping an arm's length from where Ezekiel stood. "I think you people use these charity work programs as an excuse to case the joint. Figure out what you can steal." He leaned closer. "That is what I think. I'm not a thief, sir." Whitmore's eyes dropped to the collar of Ezekiel's jacket, where the faded edge of a chain was barely visible against weathered skin. He reached out before Ezekiel could react and hooked one finger into the chain, pulling it free from beneath the shirt. 11 dog tags spilled out, clicking against each other like wind chimes made of memory. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. He let the tags rest against Ezekiel's chest, but did not release the chain, keeping the old man tethered like a dog on a leash. His lips moved as he counted. 11, Whitmore said slowly. He looked up at Ezekiel's face, searching for something. Guilt, perhaps. Fear. 11 dog tags. You want to explain to me why a homeless man is walking around my base with 11 sets of military identification? They are not mine to keep, Ezekiel said quietly. The same words he had spoken earlier. I'm just carrying them home. Whitmore laughed. It was not a kind sound. He released the chain and stepped back, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. Carrying them home. That is rich. He turned to address the sailors watching through the window, raising his voice so they could hear. You getting this? He is carrying them home. The young sailors looked uncomfortable. One of them, a petty officer third class with acne scars and nervous eyes, glanced away. Let me tell you what I see, Whitmore continued, turning back to Ezekiel. I see a man who probably bought these at a pawn shop or fished them out of a dumpster behind the VA. I see a con artist who uses them to get sympathy. Free meals. Handouts. He stepped closer again, close enough that Ezekiel could count the thread count in his uniform. I see stolen valor walking around in a costume of service. The words landed like blows. Ezekiel absorbed them the way he had absorbed so many blows over the years, letting them pass through him without lodging in the places that still bled. You expect me to believe you earned these, Whitmore pressed. You expect me to believe you served. He gestured at Ezekiel's torn jacket, his worn boots, the general state of a life that had collapsed inward. Look at yourself. Look at what you are. You think a real veteran ends up like this? Some do, Ezekiel said softly. Something flickered in Whitmore's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, that the old man would not simply cower. He reached for Ezekiel's arm, grabbing just above the wrist with more force than necessary. What else are you hiding under here? He demanded, pushing up the sleeve of the olive jacket. The fabric bunched and rode up past the elbow, and there it was. Faded blue-gray ink against weathered skin. An anchor, heavy and traditional, the kind of tattoo sailors have been getting for 100 years. But beneath the anchor, numbers, coordinates, and wrapped around the anchor's shank like rope, a date. February 16th, 1991. Whitmore stared at the tattoo. His grip loosened slightly, but did not release. What is this? He asked, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Before Ezekiel could answer, the door opened again. Senior Chief Vance stepped inside, her presence filling the small space with a different kind of authority. She had changed out of her flight suit and into working utilities, clipboard still in hand, but her eyes were fixed on the tattoo visible on Ezekiel's forearm. Lieutenant, she said, and her voice carried the particular weight of a senior enlisted addressing a junior officer who was about to make a serious mistake. A word, sir. Whitmore released Ezekiel's arm and turned, irritation flashing across his features. Senior Chief, I am in the middle of something here. Vance did not look at him. She was still staring at the coordinates on Ezekiel's arm, her lips moving slightly as if calculating distance and location. Her face had gone very still. Those coordinates, she said slowly. 19 degrees north, 65 degrees west. She finally looked up at Ezekiel's face, and something in her expression had shifted. That is the Persian Gulf. That is where the Princeton went down. Ezekiel said nothing. He simply pulled his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo, and returned to his bucket and mop. Whitmore looked between them, confusion replacing confidence. "The Princeton. What are you talking about? What does some old ship have to do with anything?" Vance finally turned to address him, and her voice was very quiet. "That old ship, Lieutenant, struck a mine in 1991. 11 sailors went into the water." She paused, and one rescue swimmer went in after them. The bathroom fell silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant thrum of helicopter rotors on the flight line outside. Ezekiel continued gathering his cleaning supplies, movements precise and unhurried, as if the conversation happening around him was about someone else entirely. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, but Vance was already turning away, pulling out her phone, moving toward the door with purpose in her stride. "I need to check something," she said over her shoulder. "Lieutenant, I would strongly suggest you do not let that man leave the building." The door swung shut behind her. Whitmore stood in the middle of the bathroom, suddenly uncertain, watching the old man methodically wring out his mop as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. He just did not know it yet. Senior Chief Vance walked through the hangar with her phone pressed to her ear, weaving between tool carts and maintenance scaffolding without seeing any of it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. 30 years in the past, in a classroom at Rescue Swimmer School in Pensacola, where an instructor had pulled up grainy footage on a television screen and told a room full of candidates that what they were about to see was the standard they would spend their careers trying to meet. The video had been shot from the helicopter. Choppy, unstable, the camera struggling to capture anything through the spray and darkness and the orange glow of burning fuel on the water surface. But you could see him, a single figure in the chaos, swimming stroke after stroke toward the flames, disappearing beneath the surface, emerging with a body clutched against his chest, swimming back to the rescue basket, letting go, turning around, swimming back into hell. 11 times. The instructor had paused the video on a frame that showed the swimmer being hauled into the helicopter at the end, his wetsuit torn, blood mixing with seawater on the deck, his arms hanging limp because the muscles had simply stopped working. Hypothermic. Shrapnel wounds to the shoulder and back. 6 hours in the water. Chief Petty Officer Ezekiel Toomey, the instructor, had said, "Call sign Anchor. This is what we train for. This is who we aspire to be." Vance had memorized that name. Every rescue swimmer did. Toomey was legend, myth, the ghost story they told each other during Hell Week when their bodies screamed for them to quit. He stayed in the water. He did not stop. He brought them all home. And now he was here, cleaning toilets in a hangar bathroom while some jumped-up lieutenant accused him of stolen valor. Vance stopped near the office door and pulled up the Navy personnel database on her phone. Her access was limited, but she knew people who could dig deeper. She typed out a text message to a friend at BUPERS, the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and hit send. While she waited, she thought about the old man's face. The lines carved by weather and time, and something else, something heavier. She had seen that look before on veterans who had come home from war only to discover that home no longer existed. The ones who carry their service like a wound that would not heal. Her phone buzzed. The response from her contact was brief, just a link to a file that should have required higher clearance than a senior chief possessed. But favors were currency in the Navy, and Vance had been collecting them for 30 years. She opened the file and began to read. Chief Petty Officer Ezekiel James Toomey. Service number redacted. Enlisted 1987. Assigned to Helicopter Mine, Countermeasures Squadron 14. Rescue Swimmer Qualification 1989. Cross-trained with SEAL Team 4 for waterborne operations. Deployed Persian Gulf 1990 through 1991. Vance scrolled down. The commendations filled 3 pages. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. Bronze Star with Combat V. Purple Heart. Multiple letters of commendation from commanding officers whose names she recognized from history books. And then, highlighted in the kind of formatting that meant someone important had flagged it for preservation, the after-action report from February 16, 1991. USS Princeton struck mine at 0437 hours. 11 personnel in water. Rescue swimmer Toomey conducted water entry against orders at 0442. Retrieved all 11 survivors over 6-hour period despite fire on water surface, hypothermic conditions, and shrapnel wounds sustained during initial approach. Recommended for Navy Cross. Downgraded to Navy and Marine Corps Medal due to classified operational details. Vance lowered her phone. Her hands were not quite steady. Downgraded to Navy and Marine Corps Medal. That meant whoever had reviewed the recommendation had decided the full story could not be told, that whatever Ezekiel Toomey had actually done that night was too sensitive for public acknowledgement. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor. They had given him something lesser, not because he deserved less, but because the truth was classified. She scrolled further. Discharge date 2005. Honorable. And then nothing. No forwarding address. No pension collection records after 2007. No contact information of any kind. He had simply vanished. Vance looked back toward the bathroom door, where she had left Lieutenant Whitmore, standing over a man who had saved 11 lives in a single night and been forgotten by the country he served. Something hot and tight was building in her chest. Anger, yes, but something else too. Shame that she had watched him mopping floors for 3 weeks and never once stopped to ask his name. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her contact at Bupers. Toomey has a daughter, Marisol Toomey Reyes. Lives in San Diego. She has been filing missing persons reports for 5 years. Wants to be contacted if anyone has information. Vance stared at the name. Toomey Reyes. The hyphenation suggested marriage. And the last name, Reyes, tugged at something in her memory. She had heard it recently, somewhere in the hangar, in the background chatter of daily operations. Then it hit her. Lieutenant Commander Mateo Reyes, the helicopter pilot who had just departed for an emergency rescue mission 3 hours ago. The one whose voice she heard on the radio every day, calm and professional, running extractions with the same quiet competence that rescue swimmers learn to trust with their lives. Reyes had mentioned once, during a briefing, that his father had been Navy, that his father had nearly died in the Gulf War, that the only reason Mateo Reyes existed at all was because someone had pulled his father from the water. Vance began walking back toward the hangar floor, faster now. The pieces were falling into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle solving itself. Mateo Reyes was due back any minute. His helicopter was already on approach. And somewhere in this building, the man who had saved his father's life was being humiliated by an officer who did not know what he was looking at. She passed a maintenance crew wrestling with a rotor assembly, past a group of young sailors heading to chow, past the spot where Whitmore had first confronted Ezekiel and where a mop and bucket still sat abandoned against the wall. The radio on the wall crackled to life. Tower, this is Vanguard 7. Inbound from rescue operation, requesting priority landing. We have injured aboard. Vance stopped walking. She knew that voice. Calm, professional, steady as bedrock. Mateo Reyes was coming home, and he had no idea who was waiting for him. Lieutenant Whitmore stood in the bathroom doorway, blocking the exit, arms crossed over his chest in a posture he believed conveyed authority. In truth, it conveyed the uncertainty of a man who had sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet, but refused to acknowledge it. "You're not going anywhere," he said to Ezekiel. "Not until I get some answers." Ezekiel set down his mop and bucket. He did not argue, did not protest, simply stood with his hands at his sides, waiting, the way a man waits for a storm he knows he cannot outrun. "The senior chief seems to think those coordinates mean something," Whitmore continued. He pulled out his phone and began typing, searching for something. February 1991. Persian Gulf. He scrolled through results, his frown deepening. Some ship called the Princeton. Ezekiel said nothing. Whitmore looked up from his phone, eyes narrowing. "It says here 11 sailors were rescued." He studied Ezekiel's face for any reaction. 11. Same as your little dog tag collection. He stepped closer. That is a hell of a coincidence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere beyond the walls, helicopter rotors were growing louder, an approaching aircraft descending toward the flight line. "You know what I think?" Whitmore said, and it was clear he was about to share his theory whether invited to or not. "I think you read about this somewhere. Found the names. Bought dog tags made with those names to sell your little sob story." He smiled, pleased with his own deduction. "Pretty clever, actually. Tragic rescue. Dead sailors. Perfect sympathy bait." "They are not dead," Ezekiel said quietly. Whitmore blinked. "What?" "The 11, Ezekiel said." He raised his eyes to meet the lieutenant's, and something in them had changed. The passive acceptance was still there, but beneath it, something harder was surfacing. Something forged in water and fire, and the kind of darkness that most men never saw. They did not die that night. I brought them home. Whitmore laughed, but it was a nervous sound. You brought them home." He gestured at Ezekiel's threadbare clothes, his weathered face, the general ruin of his circumstances. "You expect me to believe that you personally rescued 11 sailors from a sinking ship?" Ezekiel did not answer. He simply reached up and pulled the chain of dog tags from beneath his shirt, holding them out so the metal caught the fluorescent light. "Diego Reyes," he said, touching the first tag. "Petty officer, second class. He was pinned under debris when I found him. Water filling his lungs. He kept trying to push me away, telling me to save the others first. He was 23 years old, and he thought he was already dead." Whitmore's smile faltered. "Anthony Kowalczyk," Ezekiel continued, moving to the next tag. "Seaman, 19 years old. First deployment. He could not swim. He was holding onto a piece of wreckage when I reached him, and he would not let go even after I got him to the basket. They had to pry his fingers loose." The lieutenant took a half step back, but Ezekiel kept speaking, his voice gaining strength with each name. "Marcus Fontaine, Darnell Washington, Joseph Marchetti, Samuel Park." Each name spoken like a prayer, each tag touched with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. Didi Oduya, Kevin Sullivan, Brian Brennan, Thomas Delacroix. He paused on the last tag, holding it separate from the others. His thumb traced the embossed letters with a tenderness that made Whitmore look away. "Terrence Little Crow," Ezekiel said softly. "He was not on the Princeton. He was my partner, my brother. He died 7 years later in a training accident, and I've been carrying him with me ever since." The bathroom was silent except for the growing thunder of helicopter rotors outside. The aircraft was close now, very close, descending toward the hangar. Whitmore swallowed. His phone hung forgotten in his hand. The smug certainty that had carried him through this confrontation was crumbling, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Those coordinates on your arm," he said, and his voice had lost its edge. "You're telling me those are real. You were telling me you were actually there." 19 degrees, 42 minutes north, Ezekiel recited. 65 degrees, 18 minutes west. February 16th, 1991. USS Princeton. Mine strike at 0437 hours. I was in the water by 0442. He let the dog tags fall back against his chest. I did not come out until after 1000 hours. 6 hours and 18 minutes. 11 souls. The rotors were deafening now, the sound filling the hangar, shaking the walls. Through the small window in the bathroom door, Whitmore could see maintenance crews moving toward the flight line, preparing for the incoming aircraft. "That is impossible," Whitmore said, but his voice had shrunk to almost nothing. "No one could survive that. No one could do what you were describing." Ezekiel looked at him with eyes that had seen the bottom of the ocean and the inside of fire, and the faces of men who had given up hope until a hand reached through the darkness and pulled them back. "I did not have a choice," he said simply. "They were drowning. I knew how to swim." The helicopter touched down outside with a shudder that Ezekiel felt in his bones. The rotor wash rattled the hangar doors, sent loose papers swirling through the maintenance bay, and carried with it the voice of the pilot crackling through every radio in the building. "Tower, Vanguard 7 is down. Rescue successful. Request medical personnel to the flight line." Lieutenant Commander Mateo Reyes had come home, and in his pocket, he carried the dog tags of a father who had almost died in 1991, along with a photograph that father had given him decades ago. A photograph of a young rescue swimmer standing on the deck of a helicopter, exhausted and bleeding and alive. A photograph of the man now standing in a hangar bathroom, surrounded by the ruins of a life that had drifted too far from shore. The truth was about to land. The hangar doors groaned open to receive the helicopter, flooding the maintenance bay with afternoon sunlight and the acrid smell of exhaust. Crew members jogged toward the aircraft as its rotors slowed, medical personnel pushing a stretcher through the organized chaos. Senior Chief Vance stood near the office door, phone still in hand, watching the scene with the particular stillness of someone waiting for a collision she could not prevent. Chief Warrant Officer Delphine Okonkwo appeared at her shoulder. The woman was 55 years old, built like a fireplace, with graying locks pulled back from a face that had seen every kind of human suffering and refused to look away from any of it. She ran the unofficial veteran support network that operated in the shadow of the base, connecting homeless vets with resources the official channels could not or would not provide. Heard there was some trouble in the hangar, Okonkwo said. Her voice carried the particular cadence of someone who had grown up in Lagos and served 30 years in the American Navy. Something about a day laborer. Vance turned to look at her. You know him. The old man with the cleaning crew. Okonkwo nodded slowly. Ezekiel. Been trying to help him for months. She paused, her eyes moving to the bathroom door at the far end of the hangar, where Whitmore was still presumably conducting his interrogation. He will not take it. Every time I offer, he just says he does not deserve it. Do you know who he is? Okonkwo's expression shifted. I know he is Navy. I know he served. She looked back at Vance. I know he carries a weight that is crushing him. Beyond that, he has never said. Vance pulled up the personnel file on her phone and handed it over. Okonkwo read in silence, her face changing by degrees. First recognition, then disbelief, then something that looked like grief and wonder combined. Anchor, she whispered. She looked up at Vance with eyes that had gone bright. That is Anchor in there, with Lieutenant Whitmore. Yes. Okonkwo was already moving, her boots loud against the concrete floor. Vance followed, both women cutting through the maintenance bay toward the bathroom door. Behind them, the helicopter's rotors finally spun down to silence, and Lieutenant Commander Mateo Reyes emerged from the cockpit, pulling off his helmet as he walked. He was tall, lean, with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of flying rescue missions into places that wanted to kill him. His flight suit was stained with salt spray and what might have been blood, though he moved without injury. The rescue had been successful. Someone else would live because Mateo Reyes had done his job. He began his post-flight walk around the aircraft, checking for damage, dictating notes into a small recorder. His father's dog tags hung around his neck next to his own, visible through the open collar of his suit. Diego Reyes had passed 3 years ago, but Mateo carried him into every flight. Commander, one of the maintenance crew, called out. There is some kind of situation in the head. Lieutenant Whitmore and some homeless guy. Mateo paused his inspection. What kind of situation? The young sailor shrugged. I do not know, sir. Senior Chief Vance was asking about coordinates. Something about the Princeton. The name hit Mateo like a physical blow. He had grown up on stories of the Princeton. His father had told him at every family gathering, every birthday, every quiet moment when Diego Reyes looked at his son and marveled that he was alive to see him. The mine strike, the fire, the water flooding his lungs, and the swimmer who had refused to stop. Mateo had joined the Navy because of those stories, had become a rescue pilot because he wanted to be the one who brought people home the way someone had brought his father home. He had spent his entire career searching for the man in his father's stories, the legend known only by a call sign that had become myth. Anchor, what did you say? Mateo asked, his voice sharp. What coordinates? The sailor looked uncertain. I do not know exactly, sir. Something about the Gulf. The senior chief seemed pretty worked up about it. Mateo was running before the sailor finished speaking. He crossed the hangar floor in long strides, weaving between tool carts and aircraft components, his heart pounding against his ribs. Ahead, he could see Okonkwo and Vance converging on a bathroom door, could see Whitmore emerging, his face pale and uncertain, looking like a man who had just discovered he was standing on a fault line. The lieutenant saw Mateo approaching and straightened, attempting to reassemble his authority. "Commander, there's a situation here. A vagrant who claims to be." Mateo pushed past him without a word. The bathroom was small, lit by buzzing fluorescents, smelling of bleach and industrial cleaner. And in the corner, next to a mop and bucket, stood an old man with weathered skin and gray hair and eyes that Mateo recognized from a photograph he had carried for 20 years. The photograph showed a young man, exhausted and bleeding, standing on the deck of a helicopter, soaking wet, arms limp at his sides, surrounded by survivors who owed him their lives. His father had taken that photograph himself, shaking hands holding a disposable camera, determined to capture the face of the man who had pulled him from the water. "Give this to your children," Diego Reyes had told Mateo on his deathbed. "Find him if you can. Tell him thank you." Mateo stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. The old man looked back at him with the patient resignation of someone who expected nothing good to come through any door. But something in Mateo's face must have registered, because Ezekiel's expression flickered. His head tilted slightly. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to place a memory. "You look like someone I used to know," Ezekiel said quietly. "A long time ago." Mateo reached beneath his flight suit and pulled out the chain around his neck. 2 sets of dog tags. His own, and the ones his father had pressed into his hands 3 years ago. "Diego Reyes," Mateo said, and his voice cracked on the name. "Petty Officer 2nd Class. He was pinned under debris when you found him. Water filling his lungs. He kept trying to push you away." Ezekiel went very still. "He was my father," Mateo continued, tears now falling freely down his face. "And you saved his life." The silence that followed Mateo's words was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the hangar seemed to fade, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Ezekiel stared at the young pilot standing in the doorway. His mind was reaching back through decades of fog and grief, searching for the face of the man he had pulled from burning water. Diego Reyes had been young then, barely older than a boy, terrified and drowning and convinced he was already dead. And now here stood his son, wearing wings, flying rescue missions, carrying his father's tags into the same kind of darkness Ezekiel had once swum through. "Diego," Ezekiel said softly. The name felt strange in his mouth, a relic from another lifetime. "He made it home." Mateo nodded, tears still wet on his cheeks. "He made it home. He married my mother. He had 3 children. He lived to be 64 years old. He saw his grandchildren born." He paused, his voice breaking. "And every single day of his life, he talked about you." Ezekiel's hand moved involuntarily to the dog tag beneath his shirt. 11 names. 11 souls. He had carried them for so long, convinced they were ghosts. Convinced that everyone he had ever saved had eventually been claimed by the darkness he had only delayed. But Diego Reyes had lived, had built a family, had raised a son who now flew helicopters into storms to pull strangers from the water. The legacy was continuing. The swimming had not been for nothing. Behind Mateo, a crowd was gathering. Senior Chief Vance stood with her phone still in hand, recording everything. Chief Warrant Officer Okonkwo pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Maintenance crews had stopped working, their tools forgotten, drawn by the electricity of something momentous unfolding. And Lieutenant Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd, his face the color of old ash, watching the man he had ordered to clean toilets be recognized by someone who clearly mattered. "My father kept a photograph," Mateo continued. He stepped closer to Ezekiel, moving slowly, as if approaching something sacred. "A photograph of you on the helicopter deck after the rescue. He made copies. Gave one to each of his children. Told us to find you if we ever could." He reached into the pocket of his flight suit and withdrew a small laminated square. The image was grainy, faded by time, but unmistakable. A young man in a torn wet suit, blood on his shoulder, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Standing among survivors, looking at the camera with eyes that had just stared into hell and refused to blink. Ezekiel took the photograph with trembling hands. He remembered the moment it was taken. Remembered Diego Reyes, shaking and hypothermic, insisting on capturing the image before the medics sedated him. Remembered thinking it did not matter, that no one would care, that he was just doing his job. He kept this, Ezekiel whispered. He gave it to me the day before he died, Mateo said. He told me you would not be easy to find, that men like you have a way of disappearing. He reached out and placed his hand on Ezekiel's shoulder, the first gentle touch the old man had felt in longer than he could remember. But he said if I ever found you, I should tell you something. Ezekiel looked up, his vision blurred. What? That you did not just save his life that night. You gave him a life. Every birthday, every anniversary, every moment with his children and grandchildren. All of it was borrowed time that you gave him. Mateo's grip tightened, and he wanted you to know it was not wasted. He lived well. He died happy, and he never forgot your face. Something broke inside Ezekiel. Something that had been frozen since the night Elena died. Since the morning he walked away from his daughter. Since the years of bridges and soup kitchens and the slow erosion of believing he deserved anything good. He had spent so long convinced that his survival was a betrayal, that continuing to breathe while Terrence was dead and Elena was gone meant he had failed somehow, that the only penance was to disappear, to become nothing, to let the current carry him wherever it wanted. But Diego Reyes had lived, had raised this man, had spent decades telling stories about a swimmer who refused to stop. The current had carried Ezekiel here, to this hangar, to this moment, to the son of a man he had almost forgotten saving. I did not know, Ezekiel said, and his voice was barely audible. I did not know any of them made it. After I left, I stopped looking. I stopped wanting to know. Mateo pulled him into an embrace. It was sudden and fierce and completely unearned, the kind of hug reserved for family. Ezekiel stood rigid for a moment, arms at his sides, the muscle's memory of accepting comfort long atrophied. Then, slowly his arms came up. His hands gripped the back of Mateo's flight suit. And for the first time in 5 years, Ezekiel Toomey allowed himself to be held. The crowd watched in silence. Vance wiped her eyes. Okonkwo made no attempt to hide her tears. Even some of the maintenance crew, young sailors who had never seen combat, stood with wet faces and tight throats. Lieutenant Whitmore took a step backward, then another, as if trying to physically distance himself from what he had done. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that did not exist. Because there were no words for this. No protocol. No regulation that covered the moment when a man you had dismissed as worthless was revealed to be a legend. There was only the truth, standing in a military bathroom, holding on to a stranger who felt like a son, and the reckoning that was still to come. The embrace lasted longer than military protocol would typically allow. No one moved to interrupt it. No one checked their watch or cleared their throat or made any of the small sounds that normally signal a moment has gone on too long. This was not a normal moment, and everyone in that hangar understood it. When Mateo finally stepped back, his hands remained on Ezekiel's shoulders, steadying the older man who looked like he might collapse without the support. There is something else, Mateo said quietly. Something I need to tell you. Ezekiel's eyes, still wet, focused on a young pilot's face. He braced himself for more. More names. More ghosts. More weight to carry. Your daughter, Mateo said. Marisol. The name struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. His body went rigid. His breath stopped. 4 or 5 years he had forbidden himself from speaking that name aloud, from even thinking it if he could help it. The guilt was too heavy. The shame too complete. She has been looking for you, Mateo continued. He glanced at Senior Chief Vance, who nodded confirmation, filing missing persons reports, reaching out to veteran organizations, contacting anyone who might have known you during your service. Ezekiel shook his head, pulling back from Mateo's grip. No, he stumbled against the wall, knocking over his mop bucket, sending gray water spreading across the tile floor. She should not be looking. I told her not to look. She never stopped, Vance said, stepping into the bathroom. Her voice was gentle but firm. 5 years of reports, Chief Toomey. 5 years of hoping. She paused. She never gave up on you. Ezekiel's hands found the wall behind him, palms flat against the cold tile, as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. His chest was heaving. The dog tags rose and fell with each labored breath. "You do not understand," he said, and his voice was ragged. "I left. I walked away from her. After Elena died, I could not look at her without seeing her mother's face, without remembering everything I failed to protect." He squeezed his eyes shut. "She is better off without me." Okonkwo pushed through the doorway, her presence filling the small space with a warmth that seemed to push back against the fluorescent coldness. "I have heard that before," she said, "from 100 veterans who believed they were poison, who thought disappearing was a gift to the people who loved them." She moved to stand directly in front of Ezekiel, forcing him to meet her eyes. "It is never a gift," she continued. "It is a wound that never heals. For you or for them. Your daughter has spent 5 years wondering if you're alive or dead, wondering what she did wrong, wondering if she could have saved you if she had just said the right thing." Ezekiel's face crumpled. "I could not save Elena." His voice broke on his wife's name. "I was supposed to protect her, and I was not even there when she died. I arrived 2 days late to my own wife's funeral because I was on the other side of the world doing a job that suddenly meant nothing. And you have been punishing yourself ever since," Okonkwo said, "living under bridges, refusing help, carrying those tags like a penance you will never finish paying." She reached out and placed her hand over the dog tags resting against his chest. "But punishment is not what Elena would have wanted," she said softly. "And it is not what Marisol wants. They want you alive. They want you home." From somewhere in the hangar, a radio crackled. "Tower, this is Captain Matsuda. I am en route to Hangar 7. Someone want to tell me why half my flight line has stopped working?" Captain Matsuda. The name rippled through the crowd that had gathered outside the bathroom door. The base commander was coming. Word had traveled faster than any of them had anticipated. Vance stepped back into the hangar, already composing herself, preparing to explain the inexplicable. Okonkwo remained with Ezekiel, her hands still pressed against his chest. Mateo watched the old man with an expression that held too many emotions to name. Here was the legend his father had spoken of with such reverence. The swimmer who had refused to stop. The hero who had saved 11 lives in a single night. And he was broken, shattered, held together by nothing but habit and the stubborn refusal to simply lie down and die. But he was still here, still breathing, still standing, even if the standing was against a bathroom wall with dirty water soaking into his worn boots. Still swimming, Mateo thought. Even now, "Chief Toomey," he said, and the formal address seemed to straighten something in Ezekiel's posture, some muscle memory of being seen as something other than refuse. "Whatever happened, whatever you think you deserve, you are going to let us help you now. Not because you earned it, not because of what you did in 91. He stepped closer. "Because my father made me promise, and I do not break promises to dead men." Ezekiel looked at him, at the son of a sailor he had pulled from the water 33 years ago, at the pilot who flew rescue missions because of a story told at a kitchen table, at the living proof that what he had done mattered. "Your father," Ezekiel said slowly. "He really talked about me. Every day," Mateo said. "Every single day until the end." Outside, a vehicle door slammed. Footsteps approached, quick and authoritative. Captain Matsuda was almost here, and in Ezekiel's pocket, pressed against his thigh in its sealed plastic sleeve, the letter from Elena remained unopened. 20 years of words he had been too afraid to read. 20 years of goodbye he had been unable to accept. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was finally time to stop swimming against the current and let the shore find him. Captain Irene Matsuda walked into Hangar 7 with the controlled intensity of a woman who had commanded ships through combat zones and navigated bureaucracies that were somehow more dangerous. She was 58 years old, silver streaking her black hair, her uniform pressed with the kind of precision that suggested she ironed it herself because no one else would get it right. She stopped 3 steps inside the hangar doors and surveyed the scene. Maintenance crews standing idle, tools abandoned. A crowd gathered around the bathroom at the far end of the bay. Lieutenant Whitmore hovering at the edge of the group, his face carrying the particular pallor of a man who had just realized he was standing in his own grave. Someone, Captain Matsuda, said, her voice carrying across the hangar without rising in volume, is going to explain to me what is happening in my facility. Senior Chief Vance stepped forward. Captain, there has been a situation involving a day labor from the civilian contractor. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Lieutenant Whitmore confronted him about his presence in the hangar. During that confrontation, certain information came to light. Matsuda's eyes moved to Whitmore, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. What kind of information? Vance held out her phone. The personnel file was still displayed on the screen. The day labor captain. His name is Ezekiel Toomey. Chief Petty Officer, retired. Call sign Anchor. The name landed like a depth charge. Matsuda's coffee cup, which she had been carrying in her left hand, stopped halfway to her lips. She stood frozen for a long moment, processing. Then she set the cup down on a nearby tool cart with exaggerated care, as if it might shatter if handled too roughly. Anchor, she repeated. The Anchor. Princeton Rescue. February 91. Yes, Captain. Matsuda had been a young ensign in 1991, stationed at a different base, but she remembered the story. Everyone from that era remembered. The rescue had become legend, studied at training schools, referenced in leadership courses. The swimmer who would not stop. The man who had redefined what a single person could accomplish through sheer refusal to accept the impossible. Where is he? Matsuda asked. Vance gestured toward the bathroom. The captain walked past the crowd, past the silent maintenance crews, past Lieutenant Whitmore, who opened his mouth to speak and was silenced by a look that could have cut steel. She stopped in the bathroom doorway. Ezekiel stood against the far wall, flanked by Okonkwo and Mateo Reyes. He looked exactly like what he was. A homeless man in torn clothes with a mop at his feet. But he also looked like something else. Something in his posture had shifted since Mateo's revelation. His shoulders were straighter. His chin was level. The sailor inside him was surfacing, recognizing authority, responding to the presence of command. Chief Petty Officer Toomey, Matsuda said, and she said it like a salute. Ezekiel's hand twitched at his side, muscle memory trying to snap to attention. Ma'am, he said softly. Matsuda stepped into the bathroom, her boots splashing through the water, still spreading from the overturned bucket. She stopped directly in front of Ezekiel and studied his face. The lines and weathering, the gray hair, the eyes that held decades of water and fire and loss. I was an ensign when you made that rescue, she said. Stationed at Pearl. We got the after-action report 3 days later. She paused. I still remember reading it, thinking it could not possibly be real, that no one could do what that report described. Ezekiel said nothing. His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled. The report said you were recommended for the Navy Cross. Matsuda continued. Said it was downgraded due to classified operational details. She tilted her head. I always wondered what was in those details. What could possibly be more impressive than what made it into the official record? It does not matter, Ezekiel said quietly. It was a long time ago. Matsuda shook her head slowly. It matters, Chief. It will always matter. She glanced around the bathroom, at the mop and bucket, at the cleaning supplies scattered on the floor. And it matters what happened here today. She turned and walked back to the doorway, where Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd. The lieutenant had gone from pale to something approaching green. Lieutenant Whitmore, Matsuda said. Her voice was still calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more terrifying. Did you order this man to clean toilets? Whitmore swallowed. Captain, I did not know who he was. He looked like I thought he was. Did you mock his service? Matsuda continued. Did you accuse him of stolen valor? Did you physically grab him and demand he prove his credentials? The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the ambient noise of the base seemed to have faded. Every eye was on Whitmore, watching him twist. I was following protocol, Whitmore said, but his voice cracked. There was a potential security concern. A vagrant in a restricted area. I was trying to. You were trying to humiliate a man who has given more to this country than you will ever comprehend, Matsuda said. She stepped closer to Whitmore, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. I watched the senior chief's recording, Lieutenant. 3 times. I saw exactly what kind of man you are. Whitmore's knees seemed to buckle slightly. Captain, please. My career. Your career, Matsuda repeated. She let the words hang in the air for a long moment. We will discuss your career later. In my office. With Jag present. She turned back to face the crowd, her voice rising to address everyone in the hangar. This man, she said, pointing toward the bathroom where Ezekiel still stood, is a hero. A genuine, documented, unimpeachable hero. And he's been living on our streets, cleaning our toilets, being treated like garbage by officers who should know better. Her eyes swept across the assembled sailors. That ends today. Is that understood? Yes, Captain. The response came from a dozen throats at once. Matsuda nodded once, then walked back to the bathroom doorway. She looked at Ezekiel with an expression that held something very close to reverence. Chief Toomey, she said, it is an honor to finally meet you. And she saluted. The salute hung in the air like a hell breath. Captain Matsuda stood at rigid attention, her hand raised to her brow, holding the position with the discipline of someone who had rendered this honor 1,000 times, but never quite like this. Behind her, the crowd of sailors watched in stunned silence. Some of them had never seen a captain salute anyone who was not an admiral or higher. And certainly none of them had ever seen a captain salute a man in torn clothes with dirty water pooling around his boots. Ezekiel stared at her for a long moment. His hand trembled at his side, fighting decades of conditioning, the muscle memory that demanded he return the gesture. But returning a salute meant accepting what it represented. It meant acknowledging that he was still the man in that after-action report, still worthy of recognition, still someone who mattered. He had spent 5 years convincing himself he was none of those things. Chief Toomey, Matsuda said, her arm unwavering. I'm going to hold this salute until you return it. I do not care if it takes all day. A sound escaped Ezekiel's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. His arm came up slowly, joints protesting, elbow aching from years of sleeping on concrete. But the form was perfect, the angle precise, the hand flat and rigid against his brow. They held the salute together for 3 seconds. Then Matsuda dropped her arm and Ezekiel followed, and something in the hangar shifted. Some invisible barrier had been crossed. One by one, the sailors in the crowd began to stand at attention. First Vance, who had served long enough to recognize what she was witnessing. Then Mateo, who straightened his spine and squared his shoulders with tears still drying on his face. Then Okonkwo, then the maintenance crews, then the young petty officers who had watched Whitmore's mockery and said nothing. Every person in that hangar came to attention for the man with the mop. Every person except Whitmore, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, unable to move, watching his assumptions crumble into dust. Matsuda turned to address the assembly. At ease, she said, and the collective exhale was audible. She looked back at Ezekiel. Chief, I think it's time we got you out of this bathroom. There are some things that need to happen, and none of them involve cleaning supplies. She gestured toward the hangar floor, and Ezekiel walked out of the bathroom for the first time since Whitmore had sent him there. The crowd parted to let him pass. Some of the sailors nodded as he walked by. Others could not meet his eyes, too overwhelmed or too ashamed of their earlier silence. Mateo fell in a step beside him. My wife needs to know about this, he said quietly. She's going to want to call your daughter immediately. Ezekiel stopped walking. His wife. He looked at Mateo with sudden understanding. You said your name is Reyes. But my daughter's name, the hyphenated name in the report. Toomey Reyes, Mateo confirmed. He managed a small smile despite the weight of the moment. Marisol and I got married 4 years ago. She kept her name because she said it was all she had left of you. He paused. You are my father-in-law, Chief. I have been looking for you almost as long as she has. The information crashed over Ezekiel like a wave he had not seen coming. Marisol was married to Diego Reyes' son. The child of a man he had saved had married the child he had abandoned. The circles of fate had wound so tight he could barely breathe. She married you, Ezekiel whispered. She married the son of someone I pulled from the water. She did not know, Mateo said. Not at first. We met at a veterans charity event. She was there looking for leads on your whereabouts. I was there representing my father's memory. We started talking about rescue swimmers, about legacies, about fathers who shaped who we became. He shook his head. It took us 3 months to realize the connection. That the man she was searching for was the same man my father had spent his life trying to find. Ezekiel's legs gave out. He did not fall. Okonkwo and Mateo caught him, one on each side, lowering him onto a metal bench near the wall. His hand was shaking badly now. His vision was blurred with tears he had not given himself permission to shed. She has been looking, he managed. All this time. Every day, Mateo said. He knelt in front of Ezekiel, gripping the older man's hands. She has a folder at home 3 inches thick. Every lead, every possible sighting, every false alarm. She never stopped believing you were alive. Never stopped hoping she would find you. I left her, Ezekiel said. The words came out broken, jagged. After Elena died, I left her alone. And she forgave you before you even walked out the door, Mateo said. She told me so. She said she saw how much pain you were in. How broken. She said she understood why you had to run, even if it shattered her heart. He reached into his flight suit and produced his phone. She's on speed dial, he said. You could talk to her right now. Or I can call her and tell her we found you and let you have time to prepare. Whatever you need, Chief. However you want this to go. Ezekiel looked at the phone like it was a live grenade. 5 years of silence. 5 years of wondering if she hated him. 5 years of convincing himself she was better off. And now a single button press could end all of it. His hand reached out, trembling, and took the phone from Mateo's grip. Tell me, he said, his voice barely audible. Tell me she is happy, that she built something good despite what I did. She is a nurse, Mateo said softly. She works at a veterans hospital in San Diego. She helps people like you every single day. And she is happy, Chief. She is happy, and she is strong, and she has never stopped loving you. Ezekiel pressed the button. The phone began to ring. The phone rang 3 times. Each ring stretched into eternity, filled with every word Ezekiel had not spoken in 5 years, every apology he had rehearsed in the dark under bridges, every prayer he had whispered to a wife who could no longer hear him. Then the line connected. Mateo, Marisol's voice came through the speaker, warm and slightly distracted. The background noise suggested a busy hospital ward. I am in the middle of a shift. Is everything okay with the rescue? Did someone get hurt? Ezekiel could not speak. His throat had closed around her voice, around the sound of his daughter alive and working and asking about other people's safety, because that was who she was. That was who Elena had raised her to be during all those deployments when he was gone. Mateo gently took the phone and held it between them, close enough that Marisol could hear if Ezekiel found his words. Mari, Mateo said carefully, I need you to sit down. The background noise faded. A door closed. When Marisol spoke again, her voice had changed, tightened with the particular fear of someone who had already lost too much. What happened? She demanded. Mateo, what is wrong? Nothing is wrong, Mateo said. He looked at Ezekiel, at the tears streaming down the old man's weathered face. Something is right. For the first time in a very long time, something is right. Silence on the line. Then, barely a whisper. What do you mean? Mateo held the phone closer to Ezekiel's face. Mari, he said softly, say hello to your father. The sound that came through the speaker was not quite human. It was grief and joy and 5 years of sleepless nights compressed into a single exhalation. Then Marisol was speaking, words tumbling over each other, sentences fragmenting before they could finish. Dad, Daddy, oh God, is it really? Where are you? Are you okay? Are you hurt? I have been looking. I never stopped. I knew you were alive. I told everyone you were alive. Where have you been? Are you safe? Are you eating? Please tell me you are somewhere safe. Ezekiel finally found his voice. It came out cracked and raw, the voice of a man who had not truly spoken in years. Mari, he said, and then again because the name felt like medicine in his mouth. Marie, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry, baby. Stop, Marisol said, and her voice was fierce through the tears. Stop apologizing. I do not care about apologies. I do not care where you have been or what you have done. I just care that you are alive, that I am hearing your voice. She paused to catch her breath, and when she continued, her words were slower, more deliberate. Mom made me promise, she said, before she died. She made me promise that if you ever got lost, I would find you, that I would bring you home. She knew, Dad. She knew how much pain you were carrying. She knew the darkness might swallow you. Ezekiel's hand went to his pocket, to the letter he had carried for 20 years without opening. She left me a letter, he said. I never read it. I was too afraid of what it would say. I know what it says, Marisol replied. She told me, in case you ever found your way back. The hangar had gone completely quiet. Everyone was listening, unable to look away from the moment unfolding before them. Captain Matsuda stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable. Okonkwo wept openly. Even some of the young sailors were wiping their eyes. She said to tell you that she forgives you, Marisol continued. For every missed birthday, every anniversary spent alone, every deployment that took you away. She said none of it mattered because you always came home. And she said, Marisol's voice broke, she said the only thing she would never forgive is if you stopped coming home for good. Ezekiel pulled the letter from his pocket. The plastic sleeve was worn soft from years of handling, from nights when he had held it against his chest like a talisman. He had convinced himself that reading it would destroy him, that Elena's final words would confirm every terrible thing he believed about himself. But Marisol was reading it to him now. Elena's words, delivered through their daughter's voice. She said you spent your whole life rescuing other people, Marisol said, and now it was time to let someone rescue you. The letter trembled in Ezekiel's hands. Slowly, carefully he broke the seal. The paper inside was cream-colored, covered in Elena's careful handwriting. He had seen that handwriting on 1,000 notes, 1,000 cards, 1,000 letters sent to ships and bases and forward operating locations around the world. My darling Zeke, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I am gone and you are lost. But I need you to know something, my love. You were never lost to me. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And wherever I am now, I am waiting for you to find your way home. Not to a place, not to a house. Home is wherever our daughter is. Home is wherever people love you. Stop running from the shore, my stubborn sailor. Let the waves carry you back. I will be there when you arrive. I will always be there. All my love, forever and after. Elena. Ezekiel read the words 3 times. Then he pressed the letter to his chest, over the dog tags, over the place where his heart had been frozen for so long. I want to come home, he said into the phone. His voice was small, fragile, the voice of a child asking for something he had no right to request. If you will still have me, I want to come home. Marisol's response was immediate. Mateo, she said, put him on a plane. Put him on a bus. Put him on a helicopter. I do not care how he gets here. Just bring my father home. Mateo looked at Captain Matsuda, who was already reaching for her own phone. I think, the captain said with the smallest of smiles that can be arranged. 6 weeks later, Ezekiel Toomey stood on a beach in San Diego and watched the sun sink toward the Pacific. The water caught the fading light and threw it back in shades of gold and copper, colors that reminded him of fire on the surface of the Persian Gulf 33 years ago. But the memory did not burn the way it once had. The flames had become something else now. A marker, a beginning rather than an ending. Behind him, the sound of laughter drifted from the small house that Marisol and Mateo called home. Through the kitchen window, he could see his daughter moving between the stove and the counter, preparing dinner with the easy confidence of a woman who had built a life worth living. Mateo was setting the table, pausing every few moments to say something that made Marisol smile. Ezekiel had been living with them for 5 weeks now. The guest room had become his room, filled with clothes that fit and books he had forgotten he loved and photographs of Elena that Marisol had preserved through everything. Each morning he woke in a bed, under a roof, and had to remind himself that he was allowed to be there, that he was wanted. The healing had not been easy. The first week, he had barely spoken. The second week, he had tried to leave twice, convinced that his presence was a burden, that the darkness inside him would contaminate everything it touched. But Marisol had found him both times, had sat with him on the porch and held his hand and said nothing at all, because she understood that sometimes words were not what a broken man needed. The therapy had started in week 3. A counselor at the VA who specialized in veterans like him, men and women who had served with distinction and then lost themselves in the aftermath. The sessions were hard, excavating wounds that had festered for decades, but Ezekiel went to everyone. For Marisol, for Elena, for the 11 sailors whose lives he had saved, and the one partner whose death he had never stopped mourning. For himself, finally, for the man he was learning to become. Footsteps crunched on the sand behind him. Mateo appeared at his shoulder, holding 2 bottles of beer. He offered one to Ezekiel, who took it with a nod of thanks. "She sent me out here to check on you," Mateo said. "Wanted to make sure you were not planning any midnight escapes." Ezekiel almost smiled. "Tell her I'm staying put." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the waves roll in and retreat. The rhythm was eternal, unchanging, the same water that had nearly killed Ezekiel 100 times, now offering nothing but peace. "I heard from Vance today," Mateo said eventually. "The investigation into Whitmore is finished." He paused. He resigned his commission, avoided the court-martial, but his career is over. Ezekiel nodded slowly. He had followed the news from a distance, watching the story unfold through headlines and update from Okonkwo. The video Vance had recorded had gone viral within hours of the incident. Millions of views, hashtags trending, veterans organizations mobilizing in support. The public reckoning had been swift and merciless. But Ezekiel found he could not summon any satisfaction from Whitmore's downfall. The lieutenant had been arrogant and cruel, yes, but he had also been young and blind in the particular way that privilege made people blind. Perhaps the destruction of his career would teach him something. Perhaps he would become someone better. Ezekiel had seen enough darkness to know that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work. "He reached for me last week," Ezekiel said quietly. "Whitmore, through Okonkwo's program. He wants to volunteer, help other veterans." I told her to let him. Mateo raised his eyebrows. "That is generous." Ezekiel shook his head. "That is practical. Anger does not fix anything, and maybe helping others will fix something in him." He took a long drink from his beer. "Lord knows it fixed something in me, because that was the other thing that had happened in the past 6 weeks." Okonkwo had asked Ezekiel to speak at her reintegration program. Just once, she had said, "Just tell your story. Let them see that even legends can fall, and even the fallen can rise." He had agreed, reluctantly, had stood before a room of broken veterans and told them about the bridges he had slept under and the soup kitchens that had kept him alive and the 5 years of running from everyone who loved him. He had told them about Elena's letter and Diego's photograph and the son-in-law who had refused to let him refuse help. And when he was finished, a woman in the back row had raised her hand. She was maybe 40, gaunt, with the hollow eyes of someone who had stopped believing in tomorrow. How, she had asked, how did you let yourself accept it? The help. After everything. Ezekiel had thought about the question for a long moment. Then he had answered. "You do not accept it for yourself," he had said. "You accept it for the people who love you. You accept it because staying broken is its own kind of selfishness. And somewhere along the way, you realize that accepting help is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength there is." The woman had nodded, had stayed after the session to talk, had checked herself into a transitional housing program the following week. One person at a time. That was how it worked. One life touching another, ripples spreading outward like waves from stone dropped in still water. "Dinner is ready," Marisol called from the house. She appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the warm light from inside. Her smile was bright and unguarded, the smile of a daughter who had finally gotten her father back. "Come inside, Dad, before it gets cold." Ezekiel turned from the water. The sun had fully set now, the sky fading from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. Stars were beginning to appear, the same stars he had navigated by in a dozen oceans, The same stars Elena had loved to watch from their porch in Virginia. Coming, he said. He walked up the beach toward the light, toward his daughter, toward the home he had finally allowed himself to find. And if you're watching this story from wherever you are in the world, whether from a city full of strangers or a town where everyone knows your name, remember what Ezekiel Toomey learned in that hangar. That no one is too lost to be found. That no one is too broken to be healed. That even the strongest swimmers eventually need to let the shore come to them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances exist for those brave enough to accept them, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And look around you, in your neighborhood, at your workplace, on the street corners you pass every day, because the next quiet legend might be closer than you think. Still here, Ezekiel whispered to the stars as he reached the door. Still here, Terry. Still here, Elena. Finally home. He stepped inside, and the door closed gently behind him.